Welcome back and this next episode of Mapping the Shadow. So for the last couple of episodes here, we've been talking about the dynamics of mind in regards to projection and empathy, and how these two things are somewhat synonymous. I mean, both are essentially a way of seeing the world in terms of ourselves, with slight differences there in terms of connotation, but actually that it's all part of this wider quality of mind that is about recognizing itself in experience, this bivalent and self-reflective nature of mind that is necessary for any kind of self-knowledge to occur. And therefore, this brings up the point around defense mechanisms and what we mean and why they exist. In the last episode, I talked about the phenomena of projection and how I believe there's actually 8 different kinds of projection, not just the one we ordinarily associate as a defense mechanism, and the one you might have been trained to look out for in yourself and in the world as a way of understanding what your own shadow is. That's very useful, of course, and I've tried to explain the mechanics of that and why that unfolds the way it does. However, nothing is one-sided in shadow work, and there's often a good reason why these things exist. And again, I think it's important to differentiate between so-called projection that's being done as a way to avoid oneself versus projection that's occurring in line with your greater will and your better self towards greater realization of self-knowledge. This is not something that can just occur in an instant. This is not something that you're born with. There's an unfolding here. And this is what the idealist philosophers were all about. This is what they talked about endlessly. And so when we start talking about the more psychological aspects in Jungian psychology or in Freudian psychology, it can be very useful to an extent. There's certainly utility here in understanding our own mind, our own patterns. But so much as it might get things right and point you in the right direction, it can, by the same token, be very, very misleading. For as long as it denies that meta lesson around duality and the fact that there's truth in both sides, if the idea of defensive projection is a conscious thesis, right, this is how we're now going to navigate the world. Well, that means that there's some truth in that, but it also means that there's an extreme form of that that falls in love with itself. And that also means that there's also an opposite, that itself has a kind of shadow, which is another irony. And that is that maybe sometimes what you think you're seeing out there is not only not entirely false, let's say, but actually is giving you a very good reading as to what you're experiencing. I talked about how, say, if you're seeking coaching, whether it's with me or with someone else, yeah, I'm going to help you look at how your experiences give you clues as to the nature of your own mind. But the idea is not to patronize you or to say, haha, look, you're just making this all up yourself. It's just you're the problem. No, the idea is to empower you to become uncontradictory in yourself. And how is that not related to trusting your own judgment and experience about things? When the entire Western world and pop spirituality world is telling you to not judge and just whatever you do, never judge anyone, and with this Eastern flavor coming in that, oh, it'd just be so awful if you were to ever judge anybody, right? To say, oh, that's bad or that's wrong or you don't like this for that reason. Where's the insight in that? No, there's always a reason these things are going on. And if you take one thing away from this entire series, entire 20 episode series, 20 plus episode series, it's that there's truth to both sides and there's an unfolding, and the real way forward lies in the middle. And so if we become ever one-sided in whatever way it is, if the crowd is telling you to never, ever, ever judge, then the answer is not necessarily, okay, go and start judging willy-nilly, but there might be some clues in what the way forward actually is. Isn't that a more empowering approach to shadow work? That actually, no, there is some truth in what I'm seeing here. And not only that I'm a free sovereign being. I have not only an ability, not only a right, but an obligation to speak truth to myself and to the world. Doesn't mean you go around shouting whatever you heedlessly need to from the rooftops. We're going to be talking in several episodes' time about the very notion of freedom. This whole series is about freedom. That's the underlying theme here. Hegel said the history of the world is the progression of the consciousness of freedom. But freedom is not heedlessness. In fact, it's anything but heedlessness, because limitation is contained within freedom. And so it's really about becoming ever more aligned with what you are implicitly. And what's not Jungian about that? So based on the last 3 episodes, we've been talking about this, and that's led us nicely onto defense mechanisms. So this serves 2 purposes, this episode, and that is to, on one level, understand the ways in which defense mechanisms show up, so you can actually see them, make sense of them. But secondly, it comes with the very same caution as everything else, and that is that these labels of understanding things, what they look like in the world, is not the same as what they is. So all these defense mechanisms are going to be running past you, largely based on the work of Anna Freud. It's a very, yes, I'm going to say superficial way of looking at it, because it's talking about manifestations of these things. That's very useful to understand. It's very useful to know. But ultimately, we have to be coming back to the deeper understanding of why these are happening. What is it about the nature and structure of the mind that's bringing us back to these mechanisms? Why are they showing up? What is it showing about us? And that means we don't have to get caught up in projecting projection, or deflecting deflection, or reacting to reactions. The mind has to come back to itself eventually. So, firstly, a caution from none other than Marie-Louise von Franz in her book Projection and Recollection in Jungian Psychology. She said, "What may or may not be described as projection is today still very largely a question of judgment and or of careful assessment, so that in my opinion, psychologists should use the greatest caution and discretion in dealing with this concept." So, just setting the scene here, and this goes out to anyone who likes to use this term in daily life, or who has ever accused anyone else of projection, or has been accused of it yourself. We're all accused, we're all guilty, okay? This is just how the mind works. And I find it very interesting, and not least very ironic, that the word projection has come to have such negative connotations, when, as I've made the point, and as others like Michael Siren have made the point, that when we're talking about projection, we're really talking about empathy. And so if you throw out projection, you're throwing out your empathy. You're throwing out your very willingness to meet and be transformed by experience. So we're going to talk about the 8 kinds of projection again, briefly. If you want a deeper discussion on this, just go to the previous episode here. But in simple terms, it's like this. There's actually 3 different dimensions through which this so-called projection or empathy can actually unfold. Firstly, yes, we see the world in terms of what we know. But that can also mean that we either make assumptions or superimpose what we consciously know onto what we experience, and by the same token, render the unknown in terms of what we know. So Jung he didn't call it the directedness of mind, I'm kind of calling it that, but he referred to it as this directedness of mind. And the flip side to that is, of course, censorship or inhibition, or what might be termed ignorance, not seeing what cannot be understood. It makes complete sense, because the mind can only render in terms of what it knows. So firstly, there's this fact that we're just seeing in terms of what we know, and that means that what we call projection can be both unconscious and conscious. Well, projection technically is unconscious, but there's also the conscious recognition of what we know. And secondly, this process of seeing what we know and recognize in the world can apply to both light and dark qualities. Now, you ask 100 people on the street to define what they mean by light or dark or good or evil or wholesome and unwholesome. How many do you think can give you a nuanced answer on what actually constitutes light and dark? And yet, on some level, we know. It's called the conscience. We're born with it. It comes from the self. We have this template of right and wrong. What is truly wholesome and unwholesome? There's perfectly rational reasons for this. It's not some externally imposed thing by a God that's outside of our world. No, it's a rationally determined function of existence. It's basically non-contradiction. Whereas immorality is self-contradictoriness, right? Taken to a conscious and deliberately exaggerated extreme. So, the difference between what we know consciously, what we know unconsciously, should be clear as largely pretty vast, right? And that's concerning. And that's why there's a journey, and that's why there's shadow work. So you cannot separate discussion of shadow work from discussion of morality. So there is this second dimension, which is light and dark qualities. And on some level, we know what that is. And philosophically, we can turn to the ideas to help us understand that. Graphically, we can look at the shadow map. We can understand it in terms of extremities. We can take, for example, something like discipline and say, it's good to be structured, right? But if you take it really, really far, it becomes rigid. On the contrary, it's good to be flexible. If you take that to its extreme, it becomes unreliable. So flexible and structure, these would be more or less wholesome, light qualities. Dark qualities would be rigid and unreliable. So even though we might not all be able to articulate what we really mean by light and dark, we all understand on some level, so we can't really deny that to ourselves. God knows there are many means through which you can attempt to deny that you know what good and evil are. There's always some way to justify to yourself, right, about that what you're doing is right. And in fact, we've explored this at length already in the mechanics of this model. So there's also this third dimension here, and that is quite simply whether it's being done with wholesome intentions or with unwholesome intentions. So beyond whether the idea or trait in itself is light or dark, there's also the intention behind the so-called projection, or the appearance and the response to the appearance of these things. In other words, is the individual experiencing the projection, are they approaching it with the empathic intention to make sense of it, to realize it, to develop ever greater self-knowledge, to embrace that tension, work through it? Or are they doing the opposite? Are they using their free will to deny that whole process, to push it back for another time? Sometimes there might be a need for that, but that's quite different from the malignant, unwholesome intention that just says, no, I don't ever need to go there. Count me out. I am doing no work. I'm already whole. I'm perfect. What's the problem? And so this actually gives rise to 8 different distinct kinds of projection. And the one we ordinarily associate with so-called projection is really just the last one. It's really that, oh, you're just doing that because that's actually what you're doing. You're just seeing what you're doing. It's a dark thing. It's a bad thing that you shouldn't be doing. And you're just not seeing it unlike me. I'm seeing it in you clear as day. But, already we should be seeing a problem there, because it's like, hang on, if I can't see it, then what good is it going to be for someone else to tell me that it's there, especially if they're doing that from a place of power, right? They're not actually doing it because they want to make the unconscious conscious. They're doing it because they want to maintain a thesis to some extent. So that form of projection that I just referred to, that's really just one kind of 8 different kinds. But when you hear about projection, often what you're hearing is just that last piece. But there's nothing to say that actually that even if that person is seeing something that's unconscious and dark in another or in the world, that they're doing it to avoid their own self-knowledge. And like I said, even if they were, then what use is it to even try and coach that person? So, moving on then, let's go to a quote by Jung in Collected Works 8. Now this is key because it speaks to why there is even a need to defend and what purpose that serves. So he goes, as we have seen, the inherent tendency of the psyche to split means on the one hand dissociation into multiple structural units, but on the other hand the possibility of change and differentiation. It allows certain parts of the psychic structure to be singled out so that by concentration of the will they can be trained and brought to their maximum development. So we actually did already look at this quote a few episodes ago, but I wanted just to reiterate that life is not all harmony, right? There is some underlying harmony to things, but within that it contains disharmony. And within that there is the need for this splitting of the psyche. And that's because it's fractalizing so that it can become known. It's like an acorn or any kind of seed growing into an oak tree or anything, right? It cannot just remain in the seed. It's not its full expression. It's the implicate order of what it can be. There's the implicit and the explicit. And in order for the implicit to become explicit, it has to go through this process of fractalization. It has to split off and become particular, piece by piece. It has to leave something out so that it can come back and know itself. And so there is this need to train every aspect to its maximum development. This does go some way to explain why we have persona, right? It's something we form in early life. It's the same process. That initial rudimentary persona is forming very early on. And it would be misguided to suggest that that has to be completely let go of, like just abolished, right? Because let's say maybe our persona is something like, okay, maybe in terms of personality type, maybe someone like the INTP or someone who's very logical and flexible sees themselves that way in early life, maybe, right? Or the opposite, they might deny some of the very things that make them who they are. But let's just stick with that example for now. So maybe they have a natural gift for subjective logical thinking, but also that they learn that as a child, maybe to gain favor, right? This is how they start to gain acceptance and love. And that makes complete sense, right? Because that's a very essential part of reality, love, right? And at a more practical level, it's also about, I dare say, survival, but it's really about how to navigate the forces of the unknown. It's a process of differentiation from the implicit order itself. And so the idea is not to abolish all of that. It's actually to come to understand it ever more fully and ever more deeply through this process of unfolding. So the INTP develops this rational thought, but then comes back to understand its opposite, comes to understand the harmonizing, caregiving aspect of life that may, at a rudimentary level, not seem that logical. But actually, as you understand it deeper and deeper, it's entirely logical. There's nothing illogical about it. And in exactly the same way, the loving aspect of the caregiver energy must actually contain logic as well, because otherwise it becomes self-serving, starts to portray that subjective sense-making, and there's nothing caregiving about that. So that's why each factor must split off in order to be trained and brought to its maximum development. So just setting a bit of context there. So this sets up a natural urge or desire to bring each facet to its full development, and that means that each facet has to be defended against, to an extent, against the forces of the unknown, at least to the point at which it starts to become outmoded. So it serves a purpose for a while. It's a vehicle for self-discovery, this journey out from the self, whatever form that takes, whatever massive multitude of forms that will take. It's a process of discovery and of self-discovery. Kind of counterintuitively, by moving away from certain things, you're actually encountering other things, new things, bringing them to light, giving them energy, allowing them to become aware. And so, of course, there's a place for defense mechanisms, right? So let's actually look at what some of those now look like. And again, just going into this with the understanding that, firstly, the framing, defense mechanism, perhaps partly by just connotations of how it's come to be seen, but it sounds kind of negative, right? And it comes from Freudian psychology. So almost implicit in that is that this is a kind of neurosis, it's the bad thing that we have to fix medically or do away with. Again, there's some kind of truth in that, because we're all split to one degree or another. This is not a mistake. This is how things must be. Spirit itself is split. Here we are. But that doesn't mean that spirit is neurotic. It doesn't mean that it has a problem. It's all part of the unfolding. Even the challenges, even the problems are actually part of it. They're actually good in a sense. So these defense mechanisms, based on the work of Anna Freud, understanding that they, just like projection, which is one of them, they can be used in a multiple number of ways. They can be used in a way that's in service of growth, in service of freedom. But of course, the natural consequence of freedom is that you also have the freedom to violate freedom. It's still free, but you're doing it freely. And that means that beyond a certain point, these so-called defense mechanisms really are defense mechanisms, or as I'll make the point in a moment, actually, you might want to call them offense mechanisms, because really what they're doing is they're denying other aspects of existence to such an extent that they're actually positioning themselves, or positioning the individual or the thesis, as higher than the rest of reality, or wanting to bend the absolute to itself. There's a very, very clear difference between the two. There's a threshold that's crossed. It's a qualitatively different thing entirely. This is that piece I termed direction. In an earlier episode, I talked about the quantity, quality, and direction of the different facets here. So that direction is really like, are we moving towards the self or away from it? Are we moving beyond the point of existing naturally in isolation, alienation, in service of the self, or are we actually turning our back on the self entirely? So let's go through this list of defense mechanisms here then. So the first is simply repression. So that's pushing threatening thoughts, feelings, or memories into the unconscious mind, or even aspects that don't fit the conscious thesis. So if it doesn't fit, then naturally it has to be placed outside of it. And that means that when this content enters the conscious mind, it literally gets pushed down into the unconscious. Maybe where it can be dealt with at a later time, it has to come back up again eventually. But again, there's all the difference in the world between whether that's being done with the intention to actually deal with it at some point, in the knowledge that, okay, this isn't the right time, but at some point I'll have to deal with this, or whether it's being done with the intention to just push it away indefinitely, just kick the can down the road forever. Denial is somewhat similar to that. So that's refusing to accept reality or facts as it is. It's kind of a similar thing. It's this ignorance, this directedness of mind that has to occur. Projection, we've talked about at length. This is attributing one's own unacceptable thoughts or emotions or traits and a whole host of other things onto the world or onto others. And I talked about in that previous episode about all the different ways that can happen, the mechanics of that, and the unified sort of mechanism for that. And it's just that the mind has to see things in terms of itself. So moving on, displacement. So redirecting emotions from their original source or the hook that has incited uncomfortable emotions and putting them onto a less threatening target. So you're like blaming your kids for something that you felt your boss did, right? So having a bad time at work and then taking it out on the family or other members of the public or so on. So it really helps get closer to the roots and deal with the thing that you're not really comfortable dealing with. Like, it has to be a challenge, individuation. It cannot just be a walk in the park. It has to involve going up against resistance. But bullying your own children or your own subordinates at work is perceived as a relatively low risk way of dealing with the thing you really ought to be dealing with. Needless to say, it will, of course, cause great problems down the line. It has a terrible impact on your own mind to take your own conflicts out on anyone. But at the same time, there's a place for understanding why those conflicts are there. They may be your conflicts, but they're also born out of experiences that you've had. Regression, sure, reverting to an earlier stage of development to cope with stress. Pretty understandable, this one. I mean, those earlier stages are kind of there, dormant, built upon. I sort of see this one as sitting outside of the others. It sort of doesn't really fit the same formula in quite the same way, but it's nonetheless something to be aware of and spot. And I think this is largely just because, well, what does it mean to develop? What it largely means is greater understanding, greater self-knowledge, greater nuance, because you've embarked through that fractalization that I just referred to. So if that isn't working, the easiest way to get out of that sometimes is just to go to a very simplistic, almost to the point of just complete black and white thinking or splitting as a way to protect the mind's self-consistency. Rationalization, creating logical explanations to placate dissonance. This is kind of the same thing as that directedness of mind that I referred to. It's basically the flip side to repression, because what doesn't seem to coexist with the conscious thesis must be cast out. That's repression, that's ignorance. By the same token, what does appear must be rendered in terms of it. So that's all rationalization is. And I talk about here placating dissonance, because what you have is a self-contradiction. You have, for example, the thesis of kindness, right? It's such a useful example to keep looking at. The thesis of kindness, which is so kind, that it actually becomes completely selfish, or even selfless. What's the difference? But the thing is, it won't regard itself as selfish or as selfless. It might want to think it's selfless, right? Or it might want to think of itself as so kind, it's the kindest person in the world. But anytime it actually then imposes on the rights and freedoms of other people or its children or its colleagues at work, this is when it starts to fall down. This is how you know it's actually dissonant, that's actually willfully denying its own growth. Because it might be like their kids are literally telling them, like, stop trying to help me. I do not like it when you try to help me in this way. And it's like, oh, I'm just trying to help you. Why are you being so ungrateful or whatever? And just complete rationalization, even in the face of evidence to the contrary. It's like, I both want to help you and I want to harm you, apparently. So this rationalization is just a way to deal with that dissonance. Because on one hand, it's like, okay, this person's objecting to my behavior, but I'm endorsing my own behavior. What gives? Is it possible that there's actually some truth in what they're saying? Let's use the other hand here to signify, okay, is there some truth in what they're saying? And maybe there's some value in what I'm doing. But is it that actually maybe I need to loosen this a little bit? I need to loosen my idea of myself, my thesis, in order to come to a fuller realization of what it actually means to be truly kind? Or is it just that, no, I just want to hang on to that because I can't handle the tension and the distance that must occur. I can't contain it. Therefore, I must describe this other side, this accusation of selfishness, in a way that can allow my thesis to remain as it is. That's rationalization. Reaction formation, pretty clear this, right? This is compensation, basically. This is adopting compensatory beliefs or doing things that are opposite to the deeper truth of your feelings. So this might be like being extra generous to someone that you don't really like very much. This might even be being particularly appeasing to someone who's actually harming you, because your greater self, your conscience knows, right? Your best self knows this person is committing abuse. Let's go to the basic shadow map. Your self knows that on some level you're being violated, but consciously you don't want to acknowledge that because it means work. It means letting go of how you see yourself. Maybe that kindness again, that could be one facet of this. People pleasing, right? A very common one. And so the way to placate that is to adopt a compensatory belief. Stockholm syndrome, fall in love with the person that's abusing you. It's very simply just clearly a way to, again, placate dissonance. You've got the two sides, you've got the power position and the shadow position, and they can't meet. So rather than there being a genuine energetic exchange, rather than you doing the hard and arduous work of genuine integration and bearing that tension, no, it's like we're just going to try and meet both at the same time without any work. So the tension remains, but it becomes placated through reaction formation, for example. Next one, intellectualization. As I've noted here, using intellectual analysis to distance oneself from emotional aspects. But then again, remember Jung said that thinking is difficult, hence let Heard pronounce judgment. So just as intellectualization can be a way to distance yourself from the emotional aspects, it is not necessarily. Right? When we talked about the INTP earlier, it might be one who, in some cases, might be guilty of intellectualization, rational thought, pursuing to the nth degree, ignoring intuition and the imagination. But let's not also forget that in just the same way, hyper-emotionality can also be a way to deny the intellect. And if you're elevating one over the other, I would still question whether you're truly honoring the bivalence of your mind. This is really key to this. This is the alignment. You've got to understand that there is this self-contained nature to the mind. And the moment something becomes elevated, it creates a polarity. Right. So last one then, identification. Unconsciously taking on characteristics of another person. Now, I think there's a number of reasons for this. One is a little bit similar to the reaction formation. So it's like adopting something that on your deeper level you don't really believe, but it placates that dissonance. It allows you to feel more comfortable in the presence of those difficult people or feelings. But also I think this is to do with the projection as well. So in just the same way as the deeper self needs the persona to engage with the shadow and assimilate aspects of the shadow. So the persona is, by definition, kind of surface level, even rudimentary. It's not the full self, but it does actually represent something related to the self. Like if our persona is very, very disciplined or structured, then there's truth in that. There's truth to the reality that we wear as the persona. But true structure includes flexibility. So I think this is also part of why identification can be seen as a so-called defense mechanism. It's actually serving this purpose where it may take on aspects of another person. If we see ourselves as very structured and disciplined, maybe we find unreliable people very, very hard to deal with, understandably. There may even be certain people in our lives who we just cannot stand because of their unreliability. But we may actually also find ourselves embodying aspects of their behavior because on some level we actually need a bit of that, not the unreliability per se, but the flexibility that it carries. So hopefully I've made all that pretty clear. This has just been a fairly short video here like all the others. So again, just to reiterate this point, that there's, I think, a big difference between defense and offense. And I think you might do well to discern the difference. Should we be thinking in terms of defense mechanisms? Is there anything wrong with trying to take an idea to its maximum development? And is a bit of defense not necessary there? And if we believe that defense equals bad, guess what's going to happen? Are we not going to have a tremendous number of problems there? Is that not just a new conscious thesis that we have to work through? The idea that defense equals bad, there's truth in it. We might hang out with that idea. But at some point, we're going to be forced to defend ourselves through that. We're going to find that actually the great counterintuitive way through is actually to embody some of the truth of the virtue of self-defense. And so there's a big difference between defense and offense. And offense would be when it goes beyond that point, and that thesis, whatever it is, maybe it's pacifism, maybe it's the idea that defensiveness shouldn't be a thing. Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it's the idea that I must defend myself all the time to an almost infinite degree in all situations. That becomes used in the service of power. And even though defensiveness might be useful from time to time, take it too far, you're no longer merely defending, now you're offending. Because now what you're trying to do is you're trying to bend the absolute, including the world, and all its particulars and the people in it, to yourself, to the service of your own apparent pursuit of wholeness, but it's not really, because it's about making the thesis the point, not the self itself. So, beyond the point, it's no longer about defense, it becomes offense. There's a big difference. And understanding it is very key to this whole pursuit. We're going to be talking more about that in the next couple of episodes, but for now, I will thank you for your time and attention, and see you in the next episode.